Also, our sportsbook reviews. Keep those in mind. College basketball starting up here in a couple of days, so you're going to have even more games to check out, even more lines to consider, those half points, those full points, 5, 10 cents a juice, all that stuff. Very, very important. So if you've only got one, maybe two sports books, consider adding a second, a third, maybe even a fourth. If you're not sure what direction to go, check out those reviews over there at BangTheBook.com. And, of course, you can always go to DSI Sportsbook and use that promo code BTB and the number 25 to get a $25 free bet just for signing up, 100% deposit match bonus for the sportsbook, and 100% deposit match bonus for the live casino as well. At BetDSI, it's only a game until you bet it. Two guests coming your way here today. The first, Mr. Bryan Leonard from WagerTalk.com. Bryan, how's it going today, man?
Everything's going great. Thank you.
All right, well, I wanted to follow up with what I talked about with Sports Cheat on yesterday's show. I know that you listen to the shows as well, so I'm not sure if you had a chance to catch that one yet. But one of the things that we talked about at the top of the show was we talked about power ratings, and we talked about how maybe they're carrying a little bit less importance here this far into the season. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the thing I have with my power ratings is as the season goes on, I find less and less advantages. The lines are pretty much getting right in line where my power ratings are. I'm not one to make major adjustments as we talked about in the past. And now at this time of the season, I rarely find anything more than 3 points away from what I have. And the one use I have for power ratings, even though I still do them, is it tells me, for the most part, where the lines are going, unless there's an injury of some sort that I've missed. If my line is, for example, 7.5, and the line is 4.5, and I like the favorite, I know I should play it then, because chances are it's going to end up closer to my number than away from it.
Well, and one of the things I talked about with Cheetah yesterday, and I'm sure this is something you're probably finding in your power ratings as well, is that, like you, I'm finding that the majority of the games are pretty close to my numbers, but the ones that are off are just either really high variance teams or teams like a Florida State, for example, where I know they're talented, I have to respect that, but they haven't played up to that talent level, and I haven't figured out the happy medium in terms of adjusting some of those teams, Florida State, of course, being probably the most notable example, Florida possibly being another one where my line's short this week against South Carolina because Florida's got a lot of talent, but we all know the situation with Florida. So are you kind of finding that where the games that do have the biggest overlay one way or another are just games you don't really want to touch?
Yeah, it's not only that, it's the teams that are really bad, the Ball States, the UTEPs, those types of teams. For the last month or so, I've seen perceived value on those teams, and a couple times I've bitten, but I haven't been biting lately as I realize that when you're giving up 55, 60 points a game, you're not a very good football team, and it doesn't matter how many points you're getting. It's a stretch to have them come out and play that one good game. So there's a lot of times where my numbers are saying I'm supposed to be playing these really bad teams. For example, the Ball State Northern Illinois game, my line is 27.5, and it tells me to play Ball State. But I've known after watching all the injuries that they've had this season and how these lines have gone that it's supposed to be a game that I'm supposed to sit out.
One other thing I want to ask you about here, and then we'll get into some of these games, actually a couple of different things, but the first one I want to ask you about here is, you've got bowl eligibility now as a major factor for a lot of these teams. Some teams have 3 wins and need to win out. Some teams have 4 wins, need to win 2 out of 3. Some teams can just remove all doubt here by picking up a 6th win this week. So is that a major factor for you here at this time of the year?
I think it's more of a negative factor after they get eliminated. You find this type of year, you've got all these borderline teams fighting for the bowl games, and you would expect them to give the same effort that they have given so far this season, not any extra effort, but the same effort. But when you get to a point where it's a team that's used to going to a bowl, for example, you talked about Florida State earlier. Florida State's got one of the longest, if not the longest, streak of going to bowl games. Once they get eliminated, then that would be something where you should know that they're not going to give that same type of effort. You can also see it with strengths of the teams they're playing. For example, we'll use Florida State once again. This week they're playing Clemson. I was actually supposed to go to that game earlier this year. I had that circled, and I was planning on going out and making that trip for that big game. Luckily, I didn't, because it's not such a big game anymore. But players want to be able to play the best against the best competition. You would expect that from them this week. If for example, they don't show up this week, then obviously they're not going bowling, and you could be pretty confident that you could make some money going against Florida State the rest of the year. That's something that I take a look at is the teams that have been bowling for a while and they get eliminated to go against them as the season goes in. Joe Gavazzi, who's been in the industry as long as I have, even longer, calls them the towel tossers. And he goes against those teams as the season goes on, the towel tossers. And you have to pay a little bit more on the line, but you know who's going to give a good effort in those games and who is not.
One thing I do want to touch on here, and I'm not sure if our listeners have seen this, and maybe you didn't see it either, that Florida State has added that Louisiana-Monroe game back onto the schedule for December 2nd. So if they beat Delaware State, win at Florida in the rivalry game, and then beat Louisiana-Monroe, they'll get to 6 wins. They made a bowl in 35 straight years. But it's very interesting to look at something like that where, for Florida State this week, I mean, not to say that they're not going to go and give an effort against Clemson. They are catching a huge number. It's I think the last I looked, it was 17, something like that. Maybe it's come down a little bit. Not really a game that's on my radar. It's actually 16 right now. But for Florida State here, yeah, obviously they'd like to win that game and they'd like to play well. But also, with this Louisiana-Monroe safety net game added back on, they're probably going to be a favorite in their 3 remaining games. So if this thing gets off the rails a little bit early on for Florida State, I kind of wonder if maybe Clemson as a second half play becomes something to look at, because now they're not in, a mode where they have no margin for error because they picked up that 12th game at the tail end.
Yeah, this is going to be a telling game for Florida State, and you'll be able to tell in the second half what kind of effort they're giving. But like them, I think the number is a little bit high based on the talent on the team. I watch every Clemson game. I haven't been that impressed with Clemson this year. They don't have any explosive plays offensively. The defense is still good, but to lay a big number to a quality team, I definitely don't think they're one of the top 4 teams at this point. But if Florida State is in that game at the half, and you could expect them to be in it for the full game, if they do fall behind at the half and they see that you're getting less of an effort for the second half, I would have no problem playing against them in those remaining games that are lined. Get out there first, because if you see it, everybody else is going to see it too. So especially that ULM, because those kids from the Sun Belt, they want to play in the SEC, they want to play in the ACC, and they don't get recruited for those teams. So that means a lot. So even though we know that Florida State may be down this year, when they're talking to their grandkids and their kids and say, hey, did I tell you that time we beat Florida State? Well, Florida State, people are going to remember, said, hey, they must have been really good, and that was a hell of a game. They don't know that it may have been the down year for Florida State.
All right, one other thing I want to ask you about here, and we'll get into some of these specific games. I want to touch on coaching situations, because we have a lot of those here at this point of the season. You've got lame duck head coaches that are just waiting to get fired. A guy probably like a Kevin Sumlin at Texas A&M. Definitely Butch Jones at Tennessee, and there are a few others out there, and everybody knows by now who those guys are. Then you've got some interim guys that are going to have 3, maybe 4 games to see what they can figure out. Maybe they'll get lucky enough to coach the team in a bowl game, and then they'll find themselves as a coordinator or a position coach somewhere else. And then, of course, you have the situations where you've got teams that know that their coaches are probably going to be gone. A situation like Central Florida, Scott Frost is going to find a bigger job. There's probably not much of a question about that. I think one team that we'll talk about here today, Toledo, I think there's a good chance Jason Candle finds a little bit of an upgrade here this offseason as well. But, Brian, when it comes to coaching situations, what do you use in terms of trying to figure out if you want to play on them, if you want to avoid them? Are you looking for any specific type of research or some notes on it?
Not really. Most of the kids will come out and tell you they like the coach. You can hear through some of the beat writers that they rarely come out and say that this isn't a player or a coach that doesn't get along with the kids or whatever. So you expect a good effort. and it all depends on, how many seniors are on the team, and if it's a young team. If it's a team that you mentioned Jason Campbell, Toledo's gone through a good amount of coaches over the last decade or so because they have had good records and they have moved along to other locations and other jobs. So I think that wouldn't make as much difference as if you've got a guy who's been at a place for a long time and finally he's having that big year and people are starting to notice him. I think the kids would want to, even though he may be leaving, they would want to give a better effort for him when they're leaving. So it's, unless you have some information about the individual teams and an insight from some of the players, some of the writers, really it's too much of a question mark for me, and there's enough question marks on handicapping these games to add to it. So I don't let it affect me that much in my handicapping.
All right, let's look at a few MACtion matchups here. We'll look at Wednesday night's couple of games, two of the Wednesday night games. There are three of them that are all MACtion. We're not going to touch on Kent State, Western Michigan. But by the way, I wrote up my college football news and notes piece over at BangTheBook.com today. Two more running backs down for Western Michigan. So they're basically down to their primary guy, Jarvian Franklin, and they've got the backup quarterback already. No depth at the running back position. So keep that in mind here if you are watching that game, maybe looking for a live betting opportunity or something of that sort. But time game here in the MAC tonight. Game 107-108 on the board between Toledo and Ohio. This number opened 6 earlier on in the week. My personal number was 2, so I'm not really surprised to see the move down to 3.5 at Bookmaker and DSI, 4 at the rest of the market. Are you surprised by this line move?
Not really. My line is a little bit higher, so it would say to play Toledo, but it's in the dead number area, so I'm not looking to play it as much. The game means more to Ohio to me, although Toledo does have a revenge game. They lost to Ohio last year at home 31-26 as a 16-point favorite, and this was on one of these MACtion games on a Thursday. And they also have, they got Bowling Green on deck, and then they got another revenge game after that on Western Michigan. So if you're looking ahead for next week when they go to Bowling Green, that would be a sandwich situation for Toledo there. Especially if Toledo wins this game against Ohio, I think we could definitely see a situation next week where if you take a look at that opening number, you may be able to get a nice number with Bowling Green, who I actually had yesterday, and one of my rare MAC losses, I had them yesterday. I didn't have anything on tonight's card. Kind of wanted to play Kent State because Western Michigan, as you said, it's a running team that's not going to put a lot of points on the board against you. So, and they're down to, as you mentioned, only one running back at this point. So, but yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have any plays today in the MAC. But I think the number shows a little bit of value on Toledo. But I think the game is more important for Ohio, and it's a proving ground for Ohio because these two may end up playing for the MAC championship. So. Slightly with Ohio here, even though my number leans the other way, but I won't be getting involved in this one.
Now, I want to sort of run through a list here of the things that you touched on. For one thing, Toledo and Bowling Green is a rivalry game. Those two campuses about 25 miles apart. They have some heated rivalries in both football and basketball. So that is a game that, while it's not going to save Bowling Green's season necessarily, it is one that they're definitely going to show up for. Now, with this Toledo-Ohio game, like you said, these two teams probably will wind up meeting each other again in the MAC Conference Championship game. And, of course, with Akron's loss yesterday, Ohio can wrap that thing up here next week, irrespective of what they do in this game tonight against Toledo. Now, what's really hard for me, Brian, and probably the reason I have this game at 2 is that I look at Ohio, and they've been very impressive. They've got a top 40 offense, top 40 defense in the per-play metrics and the points per game metrics. But they haven't been tested by a team like Toledo. So that's hard for me. When you get to a week 11 and you feel like you don't really have a good pulse on a team, that makes it a challenge because it wouldn't shock me at all if Ohio wins this game outright. And offensively with Nathan Rourke, they very well could. It also wouldn't surprise me if they lose this game by 3 touchdowns just because they haven't played anybody like Toledo yet. So I think it's really a high variance game here. And I think that speaks to what you said about your number says Toledo. The spot to you kind of says Ohio. I think that, for a game that's going to draw a lot of attention here because it's a MAC game, because it's a Wednesday night, it's a tricky handicap for people that want to get invested.
It definitely is, and although I know Ohio is going to get full effort here because I still have to make it to that championship game, you wonder from a Toledo standpoint. Now, I did mention that they had that revenge, but if they're going to play them again in another month or so here, what kind of effort, what do they want to show in this game? Just too many questions from me to want to get involved in this game.
No, I agree. That's an excellent point. That was the last point I was going to make before we moved on from this one. All right, let's talk about the battle for the Michigan MAC Trophy. And yes, this is actually a real thing, the directional rivalry between Eastern, Central, and Western Michigan. Eastern Michigan's a 2-point favorite here in this game. They lost 6 games in a row by a combined total of 23 points. They were favored by more than that last week and then wound up blowing out Ball State, which is something that seems like everyone's going to do here throughout the rest of the season. Bryan, what do you think about this number? Is the right team favored here?
I made it 1.5 for Eastern, so it's about right where I put it. I'm not going to get involved with this, but it would not surprise me. This is the game that finally catches up to Eastern Michigan. Their last 7 games, they've all been very close games. 3 of those games going to overtime. 2 of the last 3 games going to overtime. They did have that breather last week against Ball State, and we were able to take advantage of that. But now they're playing a Central Michigan team who not only hasn't had any overtime games, they had a bye week 2 weeks ago before they played Western Michigan last week. A confidence-building 35-28 win when they were down 21-7 at the half. So Central's going to come into this game with a little bit more pep, I think, than Eastern Michigan. My number says Eastern Michigan wins in a close one, but I can't lay it. This is probably one of the games that's as tight as it could be from a point spread standpoint for myself. So this is a game I'm going to be sitting out. I'm not going to get involved in this one.
And the spread is really interesting here because I understand Central Michigan's not a great team, and they do have a very good defense. Offensively, they've been very inconsistent. Defensively, they're in the top 50 in terms of yards per play, and they might even be just inside the top 30, I think. But you have Eastern Michigan laying points on the road, which is something that they virtually never do. I mean, this is a team that made a bowl game last year for the first time since, I think, 1987? So you have this program now that has these expectations, and what's ironic is we circle this back to the bowl eligibility discussion. Eastern Michigan needs to win out. They play at Central, at Miami of Ohio, who has Gus Ragland back now, and then on a short week they play Bowling Green. So Eastern Michigan can conceivably make it to a bowl. They're a short favorite as of now here tonight. They'll be a short dog against Miami of Ohio on the road probably next week, and then be a decent favorite against Bowling Green the following week. Central Michigan still needs a win for a bowl game. They've got Eastern Michigan here this week. They should win at Kent next week, and if they lose this game this week, they're in a play-on spot against Kent next week because their last game's against Northern Illinois. So, again, a lot of considerations here for this game.
Yeah, you mentioned the Eastern Michigan not being familiar as a road favorite. Last year, they were 1-0 as a road favorite. You had to go back a full decade to see them as a road favorite any other time. So, over the last decade, they played 1 game as a road favorite, and this year they haven't been yet. So, yeah, it's a situation that they don't find themselves into very often. And I think this is a good game to watch for Eastern Michigan for the remainder of the season. If they do get the full effort here and we're able to play into it, that would be pretty impressive for them with the Miami, Ohio, and the Bowling Green on deck. And if you watch that Miami, Ohio game last night, the quarterback came back and he looked pretty much out of it the first half, but as he started getting some time down in the second half, he started hitting his receivers. I believe it was like 11 or 12 to start the second half. So if he's back, Miami is once again a force, and it'll be a tough game for Eastern Michigan next week.
One other thing, and I don't know how much bearing this actually has on the game, but I mentioned that Michigan MAC trophy, which goes to the team that wins this rivalry set against Eastern and Western and Central, John Bonamigo last week, there was a picture that came up on Twitter of the trophy for beating Western Michigan in bed with him. He slept with the trophy. His wife took the picture. If Central Michigan can win this game and win both of those directional rivalry games, win that Michigan MAC trophy, it would be for the first time since 2013. So, again, I don't know necessarily what that means, But given how excited the coach was and how excited the players were to get that game over Western last week, maybe that is a little bit of a motivating factor. I don't know, but I'll say this. Maybe not the best game to bet, and I know people are going to be following Toledo and Ohio, but this might be a pretty good game to watch, too, that may come down to the wire.
Yeah, I saw that picture. I got a little giggle out of that. I think a lot of it had to do with the way they came back in that game because they were down pretty much the entire game. And if you took a look at the first half numbers, they had less than 100 yards in the first half. They looked like a dead team. I think, in fact, I played Western Michigan in the second half of that game because they had dominated the first half, and the weather was really bad. The chances of Central Michigan coming back, Central Michigan coming back in that game and winning that game were very slim at that point. And for that big comeback to come back and win that game, you couldn't help but be happy for him. And obviously, he showed it, and the kids were really excited about it, and he's just showing how much that meant to him. And of course, that's the good part. The bad part is now when you see the opposition that you're playing this week sees you in bed with the trophy, they want it even more. So, but I did think that was a funny occurrence, and it was a lighthearted poke at this rivalry and this Michigan threesome.
All right, I think that's something completely different, Brian, but we'll save that for a different show. All right, let's go to this
picture we don't want to see, right?
All right, let's go to this Thursday night game here in the ACC between North Carolina and Pitt. When I wrote up my preview earlier in the week at BangTheBook.com, I had a great stat for this game, that Pitt was a double-digit favorite in a conference game for the first time since making the move from the Big East to the ACC. Well, of course, now the number's down to 9 or 9.5, so that stat no longer applies. But the fact remains that Pitt has not been this big of a favorite in conference games. And they're taking on a North Carolina team just completely wiped out by injuries. This is a team that has 19 guys that would be on the equivalent of IR that are out for the season, not to mention the other guys that have had week-by-week injuries and some of the other stuff that goes on throughout the year. North Carolina 0-6 in the ACC, 1-8 overall. And, Brian, we knew this would be a tough year, losing Mitch Trubisky, losing all the guys they had in the backfield, Elijah Hood, they lost Ryan Switzer. They lost pretty much everybody on that offense. I don't think that we expected it to get this bad with Larry Fedora's team. Now the question becomes, sitting here at 1-8, no wins in conference, how much is left in the tank for this team?
Well, the good news is they're coming off of that bye week, and before going into the bye, they played Miami, and that was obviously Miami had the look ahead to Virginia Tech last week. Sure, I'll give them that, but for North Carolina to stick in that game was very impressive. At the half, they're down 7-6. They lose 24-19. I think coming off of that game after they played Virginia Tech the week before and were just slaughtered, they were down 35-0 at the half, lose 59-7. I think that was a good omen going into the bye week, get some of those kids that have been banged up a chance to get back out there and play. And now they're playing a team that they have dominated. They've crushed Pittsburgh the last few years. Big winning streak against the Pitt Panthers, and this was one of the games I actually did get involved with that we're going to speak about, and I took North Carolina plus the points here. Pittsburgh, as you pointed out, not a team that is used to being a big favorite here, and if you take a look at the season for Pittsburgh, this is not a team who puts a lot of points on the board. They got 42 against Rice, one of the worst teams in college football. Last time out, they got 31 against Virginia. But you take a look at most of their games, they're scoring in the teens and the 20s. Other than those two games, they've never scored more than 24 points in a game. And here they are laying that big number to a North Carolina team who has dominated them in the past. And with that extra week to prepare for North Carolina, I think is a big difference maker here. I know Pitt also had their bye last week too, but it doesn't mean nearly as much to them as it does to North Carolina here because, as you have pointed out, not only as they have these 19 players that were out for the season, they've got guys that were on the depth chart beginning of the season, third string, fourth string guys who were getting starter and second string minutes. So those guys came into the season not expected to play at all or get any time at all, and they're pretty banged up. And that bye week really makes a difference for a team like that, especially a team that's gone into the bye week on the losing streak. As you pointed out, they got that win over Old Dominion in week 3, and that's it for the season. So I expect a really good effort out of North Carolina this week, and that was way too many points in my opinion. on this here. I only made the line 5, and I grabbed those points when it came out with North Carolina, and I still think it's a very good play.
Yeah, I got this number 6, so I have it a little bit lower as well. And when you look at the bowl situation for Pitt, they have 4 wins. They've got 3 games left. They play North Carolina this week, which they're, obviously, as we just mentioned, a pretty comfortable favorite. But they're at Virginia Tech and then host Miami in the last 2 games. And obviously Miami, I mean, it's a difficult spot because Miami could have everything in the world to play for if they're still undefeated, but could have very little to play for. Because if they lose this game to Notre Dame here this week, we're not going to be in the college football playoff. They've already almost locked up the Coastal Division as long as Virginia doesn't run the table, and they're probably not going to do that. So Miami may not have anything to play for in that November 24th game. So Pitt may be in a position to get to a bowl. That only matters if they're able to win tonight's game. And, you know, I just think if we look at a very strict, very basic, very simple handicap, I can't lay 9 points with Pitt with the defense that they've had under Pat Narduzzi. It makes it very hard to blow teams out when you can't stop them.
When you get beat in the long ball, although I don't know if that's going to have much of an effect here against North Carolina, but that was when Pitt's looked bad, is when they've gone up against passing offenses. They've looked really bad. They haven't looked so bad against the running teams, but they're not the greatest run stoppers in college football. And, it's even if they win this game, you mentioned the teams they have on deck, it's still going to be tough for them to get to that bowl game. They're going to be substantial underdogs in both those games. So we'll have to see what kind of effort they show tonight. But I think this is the spot that, North Carolina has been a few times this year that my numbers have said there should be a play on them, but because of all the injuries, you haven't been able to play them. Now coming off the bye, I think this is the one time the rest of the season we can get some pretty good value here on the Tar Heels.
If you'll pardon a bad pun here, there may be a buy sign on North Carolina here as they come off of that off week. One quick note out here in the marketplace, Toledo now down to a 3-point favorite at BetOnline and DSI. So it looks like day of the game money coming in here on Toledo. And we'll see if we can push this thing down through 3. Some rogue 2.5 show up out there on Toledo. There would definitely be a line value grab available in a situation like that. But, Brian, one other game I want to touch on with you here from a college football standpoint. We'll go to the AAC here for some Friday night action between Temple and Cincinnati. Temple, a 2.5-point favorite here in this game on the road at Nippert Stadium, which is pretty impressive in and of itself because Temple is a team that I couldn't adjust down fast enough early on in the season, and now all of a sudden it looks like they've kind of picked it back up a little bit.
Yeah, you take a look at their early games. They get blown out at Notre Dame 49-16. That South Florida game, I believe, was on national TV. They lose that game 43-7. They looked really bad early on. But then once the schedule lightened up a little bit, they looked a little bit better. East Carolina, they win that handily 34-10. Connecticut, they do lose that game 28-24 as a double-digit favorite. Army goes to overtime, and they actually lost that game to Army. And I actually had Army in that game. I bet them, and I said this is a bad spot in the situation in that game. I was lucky to win that game with Army. So then they come out with Navy and get that win against Navy last time out. But there's a definite feel when they played teams that they just don't have the players for. They were blown out in the games that they were as good or better than. For the most part, they played them pretty close. Obviously, Cincinnati's not a team that has a lot more talent than they do. It'll be in that same area there. And my raw number has Cincinnati a 2-point favorite, which would lean me to that side. But I really can't find enough on this game to really want to put a play on. Cincinnati's been one of those teams defensively. They have not looked good all season long, giving up 36 to Michigan, 38 to Marshall, 51 to Central Florida, 33 to USF, and SMU gets 31 in overtime. So when they played an offense they're not nearly as good, they just can't compete. But, they're playing a Temple team who's not really known for that offense. So I expect this to be a low-scoring game. I think the under is probably the thing I would look at if I was looking at this game. And, last week they came out and beat Tulane 17-16. So I would expect another low-scoring game here out of these two.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the way to go with this game, too. I mean, South Florida only getting 33 on you is not that big of a deal. SMU only getting 31, yeah, not that big of a deal. I mean, those are two offenses that can put up a lot of points. Tulane last week, a running team with the option, only 16 points there. And this isn't really a big surprise. I think that this is maybe something that our listeners will want to keep in mind. We talk about all the new head coaching hires that are going to be coming down the pike here. For Cincinnati, you know, Luke Fickell's a defensive-minded guy. I mean, Luke Fickell was the defensive coordinator at Ohio State. 3 straight unders. They started out 4-2 to the over. Now they've played 3 straight unders. As you start to go throughout a season, you know, Cincinnati's offense is not improving at all. But I really wouldn't expect it to with a guy like Luke Fickell. I would expect the defense to improve, and it has, judging by the fact that there are 3 straight unders. Now, Cincinnati's only scored 16 points per game in those games, but the fact remains that I think when you get a coach that specializes on one side of the ball, and also you can look at this from a Tulane standpoint, although their offense is getting a little bit better, this Jeff Collins defense seems to be gaining some confidence a little bit here week in and week out. Now, they have played back-to-back option teams, so now the task at hand gets a little bit easier. So I think you're onto something there with the under, and I think that's a good angle for our listeners to consider going into future seasons where if a team that has a marginal or worse offense hires a defensive-minded guy, late in the year, unders should be pretty good in those situations.
Yeah, and I did want to point out a couple things when you're looking at the stats from these teams. A lot of times, if a team plays the same kind of offense as you do, your stats are going to be a little different. We've seen it with the option teams, Army, Navy, Air Force, or Tulane this season. When you play a team that sees the same thing as you do in practice all the time, you're going to perform better against a team like that. So make sure when you're playing a team, like say you are playing a Tulane or an Army or something, when you're looking at your stats, to back out those stats when they are playing teams that play the same type of offense as they do, because they see it all the time. So that'll give you a little bit better grasp on what should happen when they're not playing a team like that. Also, we're far enough into the season now where you could start using, or if you haven't already, started using your numbers from just the conference games. And like I'm really big on explosive plays, and a lot of times you'll find teams from the lesser conferences, they play the better teams at the beginning of the year, and that really throws off your stats. But once you get to this point of the season, now you can back out when they played the Ohio States and they played the Florida States and the bigger name schools. You can back that out now and just use your conference numbers. And that really gives you great opportunities to play some underdogs, because a lot of these underdogs have gotten crushed when they've gone out of conference. They get back into conference, and then all of a sudden you start looking at their explosive plays, and they're pretty much right on where the opposition has been, because not all these teams take the big paychecks. So that's something else you want to take a look at is using just conference stats from here on out.
That's an excellent point, and a follow-up point I'll make to that, too, is that when you look at college football, you know, there's a lot of quarterback turnover, there's a lot of running back turnover, there's a lot of turnover at all positions because coaches are either plugging and playing their recruits because they've taken over for somebody else, or a guy's just ineffective, or it's simple injury attrition that, you know, we see a lot in college football to where you probably have teams that over the first 5-6 games, maybe they were playing somebody at quarterback. Over the last 3 games, they're playing somebody different at quarterback, and using the year-to-date numbers may not be the best way to go. So like you said, I think you're at the point of the year now where maybe narrowing your focus, looking a little bit smaller of a sample size, whether it's conference play or last 3 game splits, something like that, because there's just so much personnel turnover.
Yeah, definitely. Like last night, Akron's quarterback was ruled out late in that game, and he didn't end up starting. And they had a freshman come in who had some garbage time before that. And while he actually looked pretty good, I thought, for a freshman getting his first start on the road, you obviously cannot use your accurate stats for the full season when you're going up against something like that, because you've got an established quarterback that came into the season established and was one of the better quarterbacks in the MAC. Now you've got a freshman quarterback coming in for his first start against a Miami team, and you mentioned the quarterback change there. The quarterback coming back. So you've really got to take a look at how these teams have done with each quarterback. And if you don't have the ability to know every team in and out, like most of us don't, we're not, the Phil Steeles and some of these guys that have just got one of those memories that know the third string punter on some of these teams. Just keep in mind on who the quarterbacks are, what the quarterbacks do, if they've had the experience, if they're a running quarterback, if they're a passing quarterback, and that'll really help you out when you go back and look at their schedule performed up to that point.
And one last thing here regarding MACtion, like I talked about, Ohio and Akron play each other next week. You may get a little bit of additional value on Akron, depending, of course, on the Toledo outcome for the Bobcats, but also because, that number opened 3.5. It went up into the 5.5, 6 range. Pinnacle opened at 5.5. It was 7.5, 8 before Woodson was even announced out. So that was one of those games that was constantly moving as we went throughout the week, as it looked like Raglan was going to play. And then, of course, you saw the adjustment right before kickoff with Woodson being out. But, from an odds maker standpoint, they're going to look at it and say, okay, we didn't get much Akron money last week. People are going to remember that Akron only scored 14 points. People may forget that the backup played. So we may see a little bit of an inflated line for Ohio next week. And those are the things that you want to look at here late in the year because, as we said, there are just so many more extenuating circumstances that factor into these games more so than the power ratings. But Bryan Leonard from WagerTalk.com, what's going on over there right now, Brian?
I've had a really good start to the week here. I've got a lot of my plays up on the site right now. I've got a big play coming up on Saturday. I've got, you've already got my play for Thursday, which is the North Carolina Tar Heels here. But I've got a lot of my plays up there, getting more into the basketball, now the college basketball starting up, more into basketball. I do hockey. Have a nice start to the hockey season. Haven't put out many plays in hockey, but you're only getting the best of the best. I'm not going to force up any plays there. So if you're looking for day-to-day handicapper, I've been on a nice run. Despite the loss last night on Bowling Green. But we'll get it back tonight, and we'll get it back for you the rest of the season here.
And you can follow Brian on Twitter at BLeonardSports. Bryan Leonard, WagerTalk.com. Appreciate your time as always, man. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Sounds great. Best of luck to everyone.